All right, guys. Hey, welcome back to Splints and Whiskey. Sam Patrick here with Jimmy Apple calling in from Georgia. We'll get to his introduction in a little bit here, but he's a legend in the pre-hospital space, which you can scoff all you want, there, but we will show your true glorious colors of what they are. But before we get into that, Splints and Whiskey is brought to you by Life Autonomous Care Consultants. That's LACCINC.com. Go ahead and check them out for any of your training needs, medical supply needs. They got a good catalog of training that's available as well. LACCINC.com, and they'll take care of you for any of your pre-hospital supplies, training supplies, or even in-hospital gear if you need that. All right, Mr. Jimmy Apple, as I mentioned, he's going to be humble, and we'll be talking about humility quite a bit. But without further ado, sir, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
My name is Jimmy. I'm a 22-year paramedic, 5 years well, about 7 years in North Carolina, and the last 15 years in Georgia. Uh, I have 20 years of that in 911. The last couple of years is as a neonatal and pediatric critical care transport paramedic. I've also been relatively active on social media during that time, more so over the last 3 years. I'm known as the EMS Avenger on TikTok and other social media platforms, where I create educational content specifically for people who tend to be on social media more than they tend to be on foam fret.
Yes, that's an unfortunate part of the world we live these days, where if you don't have 2 to 3 minutes of content, you're too long. But
Right.
yeah, that's one of the beauties of doing a podcast like this. We get a little bit farther into the weeds than the short the short content. um, so before we jump into that, how did you get into the content like kind of creation zone of things? Was that on a whim, or did someone kind of push you into that direction, like like me right now?
So when I got into EMS, it really opened up a love of learning.
Mhm.
And I also got students a lot, and I discovered very quickly that I had a talent for being able to break down information for people to be able to understand it. And that was right about the time that Facebook really landed.
Mhm.
And so it was kind of a convergence of my love of learning and teaching within the clinical space, not in a classroom environment.
Right.
And I liked being on social media. I'm naturally introverted, and social media is great for introverts.
Yes.
So I got to the point where I wanted to make content. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I thought it was going to be launching a podcast. I talked to a mentor of mine, Ginger Locke, who was the host of Medic Mindset, and she really challenged me. She wanted to know what I was going to be doing in the podcast space that other people weren't going to be doing, and I didn't have an answer for that. I probably was just going to do what she was doing, but not as well.
Right.
And so I just continued to work social media. And then just maybe 3 years ago, my daughters were sending me funny videos from TikTok. I succumbed to the temptation to install the app. And then the light bulb came on, and I was like, you know what? I bet you thousands of EMS providers are on this app all day,
Oh
and
yes.
they're not keeping up on their learning. And I can just kind of stealthily slip some educational videos into their For You page. And
Nice.
that's how that started.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, to be fair, like you think about the number of ambulance services that they're sitting left seat, right seat for 12 hours a day, not at a station, just scroll on the phone. So that's it's brilliant. I've checked out some of your content. We'll definitely throw up all your handles at the end of this as well. But for everybody who's listening to this, if you need some short form, super awesome educational content, Jimmy does an absolutely phenomenal job on it. 10 out of 10 recommend. And it's funny that you bring up social media and like kind of this format as a way for us introverts to excel, because I've coined the term gregarious introvert, because yes, I can be a social butterfly and float around, part of my ADD and wonderfulness, but then I immediately like come home and I just crash because yeah, it's exhausting. But
I was unable to be a social butterfly, and this has, out of necessity now, I'm having to learn how to be social because this has led to speaking engagements and that sort of stuff. So,
yeah, yeah, no, it's funny when and That's like when people talk about introvert, extrovert, things, those are terms that are often thrown around willy-nilly. But here, we'll break it down real simple. If talking to people makes you really tired, but you seem to fake the funk, like you're probably introverted. But if you get really energized after doing it, you're probably extroverted. So
Hmm.
there you go. But oh, so going back to your paramedic training, I saw you trained in Cape Fear's system down in North Carolina. Is that correct?
I did, yeah.
No. So yeah, so Cape Fear, for those who are military affiliated, that's Cumberland County in North Carolina, correct?
New Hanover.
New Hand. Okay, okay, Cape Fear, that's right. I know we have part of Cape Fear system in Cumberland County, which is where Fort Bragg is. So you've probably seen some of the Cape Fear Valley ambulances rolling around as well.
Hmm.
So you spent 2 years in, or 6 years in that, or 5 or 6 years in that system. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am very familiar with the New Hanover system, and I also worked for Brunswick for about 5 years.
Okay. Traditional ALS runs. I guess for that's one thing about like we have a lot of listeners that don't quite understand the first response system. Like if I say third service, no one understands what that means. What was that system set up like? Was it a BLS, basic life support, advanced life support system, or were you primarily advanced life support?
I have always been advanced life support no matter where I've worked. So I have familiarity with the hospital-based ALS system, with a county-based ALS system, and I have familiarity with private service.
Okay, so you've gotten all the touch points. Any uh, fire service based systems at all?
Well, I'm not a fireman.
Yeah, well,
Never interested me. So yeah,
okay, that's fair. No, I know there's some like we have a King County Medical one out here, for instance. They do a lot of direct. They behave in the administrative aspect, kind of like the fire service, but it's a traditional third service EMS. Enough
sure.
about that.
And I think very highly of that service.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
it's 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 interesting because I don't think when I talked to a fellow the other day, there's very few traditional third service EMS systems, and when we say third service, it's the basically a government run emergency medical system. Like it's all kind of rolled into the fire service in so many places. All right, so now you're living in Georgia. What was the causation to go down the road a little bit to live in Georgia?
Well, I am a Navy veteran, and when I joined the Navy, a lot of family, I was raised in New Jersey. A lot of my family moved to different parts of the country. And so I was basically had nowhere to go when I got out of the Navy. I moved to North Carolina because my mom lived there, and I got married, had a family, kids, and then my family members all gradually started moving to the Atlanta area, and I was the last holdout. And
Okay,
so it was a good opportunity to move to be closer to a lot of family.
right on. Um, what system were when you moved to Atlanta? What agency did you start working there with?
I worked, I'm not sure if I want to name the agency.
Okay, fair.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
fine. That's fine. We don't have to name it. Was it a hospital based system or was it a
it was a
civil
private
based?
service, and
Okay,
yeah, and the only reason I don't want to name it is because I don't know if they want the attention, but I think very highly of the service, and my time there was fantastic.
right on. Well, good times. Um, I guess going back to what got you to want to do paramedicine.
Um, I was an electrician,
Okay.
and it was a satisfying career, but I didn't pick it. In fact, I never really had any ambition prior to kind of backing into being an electrician, and I just ended up having a talent for it. But when my grandfather was dying of cancer, we had a conversation where it was clear that he regretted not being able to do what he wanted to do his whole life, which was to be an agricultural veterinarian. World War II just got in the way of his plans, and he ended up being a plumber his entire life. And I didn't want to look back at
Right.
that, on my deathbed and think my whole life just, I just made widgets because that's what I had to do, and I wanted my
Right.
kids to see that you could do something, and make a change. And I really, at that point too, wanted to do something that I felt like really was something that served your community.
Hmm.
And so on a whim, I just went and took an EMT course. I thought maybe I would just volunteer to at least do something to give to the community. But I got medicine immediately.
Yeah.
And at that point, I never looked back.
Nice. That's awesome. And then it's funny how when you fall into jobs and you get the taste of something, then you just run with it. Uh, at what point in your career did you start? Well, to be fair, once you're on a bus, you're always educating, but like at what point did you kind of officially get into the training space?
I wouldn't say that. I don't know if I even agree with that. I think that there is an apathy, a thread of apathy that runs through EMS where training is quite often not happening at all. And that's not to say that there aren't great providers out there that are always educating. They're there. I just don't know if that's the rule. But I always was just excited about learning new things, and so I wanted to turn around and teach them. And I very quickly had a lot of students put on my truck as well, and I
Hmm.
took that seriously. I had great examples of preceptors when I was coming up through Cape Fear's system as an EMT, basic, intermediate EMT, and then paramedic. I had great preceptors. New Hanover County had a great precepting system, and their education was fantastic, and they were just always teaching. And so that was my example, you know? And so I just turned around and did the same thing that they were doing, which was always teaching. Why did you do this? What does this medication do? And so every day was taking a student, opening the drug box, going through all the drugs, going through what they did, which led to conversations about pathophysiology. And I just, I don't know, it just felt like the thing I was supposed to be doing. And eventually I my teaching capabilities were affirmed, and so I wanted to do more with that.
Nice. So yeah, I think you brought something up that's a point that is pertinent to make that while you have charges in your ward of people that may not be as qualified or that's going through the learning process, the art of educating, the art of inspiring is something that is hard to do. And it sounds like, and for the lay listeners, the people who don't understand, a preceptor is essentially your field instructor for medicine. So if you're on a nursing floor, you have a nurse who is your preceptor. To be fair, physician residency, usually the attendings or senior residents serve as that preceptor role. So there's somebody who is essentially responsible for making sure that you learn things. And as Jimmy brought up, it is a skill that is so individually dependent on whether they do it well. So can you like do you have any good like stories about if you want to throw some recognition out to some of your preceptors, even if it's not by name, but like some of the stories that they provide, like the stories of inspiration that inspired you to continue to pay it forward.
Well, uh, I I had two preceptors specifically with Cape Fear that I just think were model preceptors, and it was Danielle and Tim. I won't mention their last names, but
Yep.
they they just didn't waste opportunities to teach, and they were continuously pushing me. And even if they saw me studying a little bit, they would ask me what I was studying, and then they would
Hmm.
engage me on that. They, I think even they recognized that downtime is great for a student, but at some point or another, you need to be involved with your crew. And so they wouldn't allow me to check out of the clinical and just study all day if we weren't doing anything. And I just found that they were so energized by that process as well. And they were excited about the prospect of teaching. And it, that would that was just something that was contagious.
Yeah.
I don't
It's
actually remember what the actual question was,
no,
where I was going with that, but
no, it's basically like kind of because to be fair, like I look back at some of my leadership I've had in the past. The inspirational, basically inspirational leadership is what we're talking about.
yeah,
Because I think when you look at the spaces we work in, there's some really hard nights, there's some really hard days, there's really bad calls, but like we fall back on that spider web of resilience that has been helped, like been built by us, but also the people surrounding us in the spider web. So like having those inspiring individuals in your network is what gets us to kind of drive through those hard calls and also then to continue to pay it forward.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. That teaching and that precepting is an investment in the future of
right.
EMS. And if you don't make any deposits there, EMS is just becomes bankrupt eventually.
Yeah, and that's the not just financially, but also the human capital that is required. Because that's one of the things that I've noticed. That one of my prior organizations I worked with, I had it was kind of tongue in cheek, but I was when I was recruiting people, I wanted to find willful underachievers, and what I mean by that is like I needed people that could think like physicians, operate like ICU nurses, first assist like a third-year surgery resident, and then, oh, by the way, be a master planner. And to do all that, you need to be willing to not exceed that postdoctorate level training and be an enlisted guy in the military. Um, I'm sure you've seen similar things where like you have highly capable paramedics that could be doing something academically up here, but they're like, hey, I'm fine with this. And I would argue that you're probably one of those types as well.
Uh, that I should be doing something up
No,
here.
not should be, but you're capable of, but that you like the I like to call it the pre-hospital bug. When it bites you, it latches on pretty hard, and it's hard to let go of that.
It is, and I get a lot of questions about why I'm not doing something more like, nursing or nurse practitioner or physician's assistant or even MD. I mean, the answer is complicated. I mean, everybody's life circumstances sometimes keeps them a little bit penned in. I got into this very late in life. I don't want to say very late. I was in my mid 30s, but at this point, I've been in it 20 years. I'm in my mid 50s. And I mean, what am I going to do? Go to medical school now, graduate when I'm 63,
Yeah,
practice for 2 years. And then,
yeah,
no one's going to invest. I'm not going to get a loan. No one's going to invest in me to send into medical school. And I would rather spend my own money on myself and my kids.
right.
So, but even outside of that, I'm doing exactly what I want to do, you know?
And I think that's an important aspect that we need to focus on because, like, I've seen my own friends do this where they're like, I feel like I should do this. I'm like, well, if you're not even content, if, like if you're happy with where you're at, lean into it. And I think I would argue that, like, yes, I'm sure that you could easily go through and do all the things necessary to become a medical doctor and get the papers. But like when I look at the stuff you're doing through the education aspect of the public facing social media stuff, like you're already impacting people, like thousands of people every time you put a video up, which to be honest, like a lot of physicians don't even get that touch in their entire career.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like,
Uh, I believe in the old saying, to whom much is given, much is required.
mhm,
I've been rewarded for my efforts in EMS. Um, I've always been a high performer at my services, received recognition for various efforts, have been compensated appropriately, I think. And I think that because of that, that I have a certain obligation to preserve my efforts within EMS and not take that out of EMS.
right. And we also must realize that the healthcare system is this again intricate spider web of lots of messes, but oftentimes the first touch point that someone has when they're in an acute crisis is with the EMS service.
Yeah.
And like that, what we do at point of injury or initial point of illness and assessment can have third and fourth order effects that are we never can truly appreciate them. That being said, one of my big things I always have taught my students is I don't care. Like in the military medical system, a role two is like your first surgical level of care, and I always would say like I don't care if I get them alive to that role two. It's when they walk out of the role four, which is the rehabilitation hospital in the U.S. Like how fast do they get from there to there is what I care about. Um, in the civil side, when you're teaching students, how do you bedside or in the back of the ambulance can have these third and fourth order effects that significantly impact quality of life down the road.
So the first half of that question broke up.
Oh, sorry. Basically, how do you articulate to students the importance of like how important what we do at initial patient contact is and how it can pay dividends down the road for, say, like your intensive care physicians?
How does what we do, like what are the downstream effects of what we do?
Basically, yeah. Like, how do you articulate that to an EMT basic student or a paramedic student? Like, hey, what we're doing at point injury is super important. Here's how it can play out.
Well, I mean, you're giving the first impression of the healthcare system, right? So your attitudes are incredibly important. What we want to do is engender trust in the healthcare provider, because someone who is entering the healthcare system, quite often their distrust will work against them, right? We are
Right.
experiencing a culture right now that is divided right down the middle as far as whether they trust the healthcare system or not. And some people are very deeply distrustful of the healthcare system, not rightly so, but we don't help, if the boots on the ground don't display the right attitudes and humility when we welcome them into that system. So our attitudes are going to create the biggest downstream effects.
Hmm.
And, our knowledge and education, the effort that we put into that is also going to create downstream effects because we can either dump a patient off at the hospital having done nothing because the hospital was only 10 minutes away. And people love to say, I'm not going to do this thing that probably will save the patient's life because they're only 10 minutes from the hospital. Or we can actually have a stabilized patient that we are delivering that ICU level care will enhance that rather than salvage it.
Right. I think that's something you just said something that I honed in on. Um, the difference between knowledgeable, decision-based conservative treatment versus I don't want to, because that I that's a concept that like because 10 minutes is very frequently life and death in acutely traumatically injured or sick patients. And hearing that there's people that like, oh, we're only 10 minutes. Like, all right, you're not understanding that 10 minutes can be a big make or break difference. So since you're in this position to kind of articulate that, when you're dealing with somebody who is of the, oh, we only have 10 minutes, I don't need to do anything philosophy, how do you help them see, like, oh man, no, 10 minutes can be life changing?
Well, I mean, your proximity to the hospital is not an intervention.
Right.
And I think you missed the memo on why we were deployed to the field in the first place, if that's your attitude. One of the first things that an EMS provider learns in their EMS education is the white paper,
Hmm.
death and disability. And what we understood was that people that were experiencing trauma and disability out in the field weren't surviving until they got to the hospital because they weren't being stabilized right where they were.
Right.
We didn't launch EMS because undertakers had nothing to do. We launched EMS so that we could actually initiate some life-saving care in the field.
Right.
And people have forgotten what that means. Turn and burn seems to be what they really want to do. It's about churn, and it's the system isn't helping them because they want them to maintain these unrealistic 10-minute scene times. And we're finding, with trauma that, the whole platinum 10 minutes and the golden hour isn't actually evidence based, and that really only hemorrhagic shock has an association with actual times of getting to the hospital, and that we have been trained to deal with life-saving life threats as we find them, right?
Yes.
So that's what we're supposed to be doing, dealing with life threats, stabilizing patients who can't survive some sort of complicated movement.
Hmm.
These are the things we're supposed to be doing.
Right. I think you bring up a very valid, like, because that's one thing, especially in military medicine and tactical medicine, is like we've basically decided to treat everybody as a hemorrhagic shock patient, which for the lay listener, hemorrhagic shock is you've bled out more than your body should. Now there's a whole bunch of problems going on, and the larger organism is spiraling. Um, which, again, especially in the military medicine side, if you look at tactical emergency casualty care, like is it a fundamental? Is it a silo of medicine? Absolutely, but it's not the over-encompassing, all-encompassing element of medicine. I mean, I think that's kind of when I think of paramedicine, I mean, just breaking down the term paramedic, like, hey, physician extender, etc. Like, it's a thinking person's game. And you brought up like breaking down the pathophysiology, the anatomy. Like, if we can teach our medics the why behind things, it allows them to make actionable choices in the field that much better. So, question is, how do you inspire? Because again, it comes back to inspiring young medics, the new generation medics, and even EMT, like EMT basics, like their scope of practice is not as broad as it can be, but like, how do you inspire them to recognize, like, hey, I might not know as much as I need to know. I need to open up this book and get in the weeds of things.
Well, the way you do that is by placing a specific emphasis on what they're doing. I mean, it, by and large, lives are saved in the field by EMS providers because of BLS interventions.
Yes.
Airway maneuvers, bleeding control, compressions, timely defibrillation, which can be done with an AED.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those things are BLS level interventions. Placing a tourniquet, and there's a thought experiment I like to run people through, which is to stop thinking about things as BLS and ALS, but as primary life support and secondary life support. Primary life support is something that BLS is all about, and they need
Yes.
to remember that people tend to live or die based on their what they do when they get there. You
Excellent.
know, often what happens when ALS gets there is often supportive.
Mm-hmm.
BLS is providing bag valve mask ventilations. Maybe there's an adjunct in there. A lot of BLS providers now can drop an eye gel. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're going behind them and just providing some more technical expertise to what they're doing. But there's very, very few instances where we are coming in and making a huge difference right off the bat with an ALS intervention. Maybe in traumatic arrest, we're doing things that BLS can't do, which is administering blood,
Yeah.
performing, a needle decompression or finger thoracostomy,
Yep.
pericardiocentesis, establishing an advanced airway. But generally speaking, BLS needs to remember that they're actually the top dog.
And that's I'm so glad you said that because I always argue that like because working heavily with law enforcement, I tell the patrol officer like you're the most important person in the chain of survival because you're going to be there first as a trained responder. But then I also like as a first responder, that patrol officer first on scene 9 times out of 10. Hey man, you're the make or break. But then I roll it to the bystander or the family member. I'm like, no, it's actually you as a bystander to know what simple things you need to do for that immediate life threat. So the person's alive by the time we tone out the big red box or the big white box. And that's uh, it always makes me happy to hear other like and I like that second or what was it primary
Primary life support and secondary, yeah.
secondary life support because yes it's anything that on the advanced life support like they still have to have aggressive primary life support done so I can do that to them when I show up. And it's good to hear. So, are you working in a system that is using blood in the field?
Most of the systems around me and my own system are using blood. Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Just since whole blood's kind of pre-hospital whole blood is a big passion project of mine. Can you kind of explain how your service and the sister services around you implement it?
Well, I know that uh, the Grady has been carrying low titer whole blood or low titer O blood for maybe a little over a year,
Okay.
and they've had great success with that. Cobb County Fire Department just started carrying. I don't know if they're carrying whole blood or packed red blood cells. I can't remember. But then I think Metro Atlanta Ambulance, which is one of the larger ambulance services in the region, they also just started carrying blood. I think that they may, depending on the dispatch, don't quote me on this, I think that they may have a fly car that takes the
Yeah.
blood. I work for a pediatric system, and
Right.
so we know what we're going to get. And
Yep.
so if there's a possibility that that patient may need blood, we just go to our blood bank and grab it before we go.
Nice. Yeah, that's another thing too that people often get confused. Not every ambulance is created equal. And then so
No.
you work on probably one of the nice big fancy buses. That's a neonatal pediatric intensive critical care transport. Nice big labeling on the side with your
Yeah.
Atlanta Children's Hospital flag colors flying. And whenever I see one of those buses on the road, especially if they're running code, I'm like, good luck. So yeah,
If we're running code, it is serious.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that I think that's one of the things too. Like, well, everybody should get out of the way of ambulances, but there are certain flavors of ambulance that if they're running lights and sirens, someone's having a really bad day, get the hell out of the way, please.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let me just add to with the whole blood thing. We are at the point now where we were a couple of years ago, where people were kind of debating whether to work cardiac arrests on scene, and we had the data to support that we should be, but people were kind of like resisting it. We are at that point now with whole blood.
yes.
We have the data to demonstrate that blood programs for EMS work,
Hmm.
and you can't even argue against it that it really only works with rural and that your urban doesn't really have much of a benefit. New Orleans EMS demonstrated
Hmm.
with they brought the receipts that they're saving lives with hardly any prolongation of their scene times.
Yep.
And at this point in time, if you're arguing against carrying blood, then it's simply because you haven't found a way to do it.
And I think that I actually just spoke at SOMA this year, Special Operations Medical Association conference on civil pre-hospital blood. And really, you know who the hardest people, like the friction point of it is always blood bankers. It's not usually anybody in the system. It's the blood bankers saying, this is mine, I'll not let go of it. I'm like, please let go of it for 2 weeks. We'll give it back to you, I promise, with temperature regulation. But yeah, Randy Schaefer is a friend of mine. She's down in San Antonio and was kind of instrumental in getting San Antonio Fire to do it. And they essentially, I think they may have been the first agency. Don't quote me if I'm wrong, but like the answers to the test have been written. So any service, any ALS service that's saying no, we can't, it's like, yes, you can, guys. There's plenty of answers. We'll help you find them. Feel free to reach out.
This is what I want to say to the blood banks. Anyone who's listening that operates a blood bank, you are not special. This problem has been solved all over the country.
Hmm. Well, yes. Don't. You have to stroke the fragile little egos and say, please, please let us have your blood, vampires. Blood bankers,
Yeah.
you're doing great things, but you guys need to let go of the life-saving product that you guys carry, and it's not. Blood's a lot more resilient than we give it credit for.
Yep.
Sidebar complete. All right. So you mentioned you're working in a portion of medicine that scares the ever living crap out of me. Sick kids and sick tiny little babies that need to be in incubators and stuff like that. How did you
Yep.
get into that realm?
Um, I had been in EMS at this point for 20 years, and I just reached the point where I realized that I was getting burnt out in
Hmm.
911. And it I was maintaining a good attitude, and I was doing the social media thing and turning lemon into lemonade, but I realized that I needed a challenge.
Yeah.
That I needed to keep learning, and I needed to learn on my job.
Hmm.
And I transported a pediatric to our local children's hospital, and I was just kind of looking at one of the flight crews who had come in at the same time we did, and I was like, this would be a challenge. This would
Hmm.
be something that would engage me, that I could commit myself to. And I talked to one of the crews who I knew because he had been a paramedic employee at one of the hospitals we transported to, and he's like, "You should do this. You would kill you. Not I wanted to say you would kill here, but that's opposite of the goal.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
would do
We'll
very
keep
well
them
here.
alive here.
Yeah, you'll keep them alive here." And so I applied, and it is exactly what I needed. I needed
Nice.
something to to help me to keep learning, to keep engaged in the process, and yeah, it's been fantastic.
No, that's yeah. So for people who are not familiar with medicine or have not had touch points with pediatric patients, they can be some of the most frightening things because you know what a pediatric patient loves to do: appear normal, appear normal, appear normal, and pff, right through the freaking.
Yeah, yeah. So this is what I want to say to that, because I've been trying to preach this a little bit recently, which is the stigma. We have stigmatized children in emergency medicine.
Hmm.
We have gone around repeating kids are not little adults. Kids are not little adults. Kids are not little adults, and they compensate, 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 and crash. You know what? Every single patient you have is going to compensate until they can't,
Right.
right? And then they're going to crash. You may have a little bit more of a curve with adults, but kids, they're not like they're also giving you signs that they're trending down. It,
Hmm.
it is it is very rare that a child who is compensating just dies
Yeah.
without telling you that they're going to, right?
Right.
Their end tidal goes up just like ours does. Their heart rate starts to change. Their blood pressure doesn't stay 120 and over 80 when they're starting to decompensate.
Right.
There are some subtle changes you'll see in their map, in the respiratory rate particularly, and they're telling you that they're getting ready to crash.
Right.
So I think that we have done a bad job of inspiring confidence in providers
Mm.
in how to take care of children. Children are little adults, and I know that like everyone in paramedic education right now, just screamed at the top of their lungs and they don't even know why. Okay. But here's the thing: 95% of what you do in emergency medicine for pediatrics, adults, and geriatrics intersect.
Yep.
You know, there's subtle differences, but generally speaking, it's not the difference between, a human being and an alien.
Right.
We're talking about drug dosages and equipment sizes.
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, the stigma is that children are these little ticking time bombs. Like, quick, get them to the pediatrician before. But, and
Let me interrupt you one more time. For the provider that is terrified of kids, thinks that they're not little adults, and thinks that they are going to crash without warning, why then are you transporting that kid in a car seat, covered in a onesie and a blanket, with no ability to evaluate the respiratory rate and giving them blow by? Like, why are you setting them up for failure then?
right. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it is it's not realistic stigma. It's yeah, and it goes back to a preceptor at some point probably said something that that person has latched onto and now it's carried forward. Um, and also too, I think there's an element of just the way pediatric medicine is done. It's like we have separate pediatric transport, we have separate pediatric hospitals, the big systems obviously. It's like it's kind of been put in this silo so people don't get a lot of touch points in it and it just scares them because it's more of an unknown than a realistic boogeyman, I guess would be a way to say it.
I mean, well, they're treating it like a boogeyman when it's not, you
Yes.
know, and it, they're doing all they can to not have to provide the high level of care that they would be providing an adult. I mean, I can't tell you
Right.
how many times I've seen a kid transported by an EMS crew, a kid that is has sternal retractions,
Mm.
seesaw breathing, intercostal retractions. You can barely hear breath sounds, but because they're working that hard, they're satting 99%. And so they're just transported with blow by oxygen.
Mm.
And the provider just doesn't realize that these kids are crashing suddenly because you're not preventing it. I
Right.
mean, blow by oxygen is a ridiculous intervention to give to a sick kid. And they are a little bit afraid to make a kid mad by, putting a nasal cannula on them or a non-rebreather or whatever it is that they have to do. So um, we're kind of full of our own crap sometimes on there. We say we have all of these sayings about kids, but then we actually don't get in there and be aggressive to prevent them from suddenly crashing.
Right. Because I part of the recertification every year was the pediatric emergencies for pre-hospital providers was the training we went through, and yeah, Strider, croup, asthma, like recognizing at least kind of the big disease processes and the relatively simple interventions you can do to help stopgap that. Two, I think another one is communication to your receiving facility. Um, so obviously you're doing pediatric intensive transport. So for people who are unfamiliar with kind of that model, Jimmy rides the ambulance to an outlying hospital, urgent care, some sort of healthcare facility that does not have the capability to manage and keep this child stable. So it's his job to come in, interact and liaise with the facility on the receiving end. So receiving rapport from the providers and nurses there, coming up with a stabilization plan before they put him on the cot, get him on the cot, make sure the patient's stable, into the back of the ambulance, maintain stability all the way to Atlanta Children's, and then obviously giving a push pull to the hospital. What degree of en route reporting are you doing with these kind of interfacility transfers that you're doing?
Well, on the sick kids, we will actually call the receiving MD
Mm-hmm.
because we know who's accepting and everything. And we have a conversation with them to get everyone on the same page about the care. So even though that physician knows exactly what they're getting from the report that they've already gotten, they're actually getting a pediatric specialty report from
Mm-hmm.
us. And, sometimes what we're telling them is worlds away from what they heard before. And so
Right.
we're giving them a really good picture of what we have. And there really is an engagement there on what's best for that patient at that point. Like they're not, okay, well, they don't just like give us a plan. We'll suggest a plan with them or have a conversation about a
Mm-hmm.
plan, something that we're all on board with. And then we actually will call the receiving nurse directly. We have a system. I don't know how many people are familiar with Volt, but we can basically reach any person in our system.
Cool.
And so we know what room the patient is going to. And so we call the nurse from that room to let them know exactly what they're getting, what we've done. And we'll not just call that nurse, but like if that kid's intubated or they have any sort of like non invasive going or high flow, we'll also interface with the respiratory therapist who's going to be taking care of that patient. Everyone knows what's going on with that patient by the time we get there.
And that's a beautiful thing that like the mobile ICU, mobile intensive care unit kind of model has the ability to do. And the thing that upsets me, sort of pseudo upsets me, it's like, hey, no, this can be exported to any ambulance system, and because giving rapport is important. A report, sorry, not rapport. Giving a proper report is super important, and it's so much easier to do when you're not sitting at the charge nurse station waiting to get triaged. If you can get it, I think that's one of the things that you've always like having worked in hospital, seeing the ambulance crews that bypass the ER, you're like, all right, well, obviously they called ahead of time and they're going right to an admission bed, et cetera, et cetera. Are you guys doing so? Telemedicine's always been a topic on so many fronts. Are you guys running any systems that so are your monitors visible to the receiving facility, or do you have to give everything via voice?
No, we're not. We don't have like linked up to our
Okay,
monitors or anything like that. Um, the only, but that being said, uh, all of our charting. I mean, we essentially just give a report over the radio and give them the relevant vitals. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of always been especially in, like on the military side of things, telemedicine, they preach telemedicine, and there's like this whole in a perfect world, if all the systems could work, like you have these wearables, the wearables go up to Skynet, Skynet broadcasts it to wherever it needs to go, and like I'm always curious if any civil systems have kind of cracked the nut on that, but to be honest, I haven't heard of one yet
Yeah.
personally.
Remember too that a lot of these systems are all entering in this info into Epic.
Yes.
Even the ones that are outside of our system, are still entering into Epic. Um, and Yeah, I don't want to dive too deep into our system processes.
No,
Yeah,
it's more just service level. I'm curious to see
yeah,
where things are. And for those who are not familiar with what Epic is the largest, oh, don't quote me if I'm wrong, but it's the most pervasive electronic health record that I'm aware of, and it has a feeder through a lot of the other electronic health records. So if you're being seen in hospital, the likelihood of it being charted in Epic is pretty high, and if it's not Epic, it's probably a Cerner-based system. So that's for our health analytic nerds out there. Throw some love to you guys. Um,
yeah.
One thing we talked about earlier on, and so like I think too, like um, kind of we'll build a spider web here of how do we connect the dots of so pediatric medicine. We've created this stigma of it being scary, which you could argue that there's a degree of like humility we've mentioned a couple of times now. It's like so when I see that there's knowledge gaps or there's stigmas about things, sometimes I have a perception that there are certain people inside of the silo that is feeding that stigma or not dispelling that could be a byproduct of a lack of humility with certain individuals inside of that silo. That being said, I know we both are firm believers in humility. How important do you think it is in just medicine in general, healthcare in general, to have a healthy degree of humility when it comes to interacting with people to your left and right?
Well, I think it's an integral part. I mean, I don't want to speak to the greater healthcare system, but what I can say about EMS is that we are not set up to have humility. And in all reality, healthcare at its essence is holistic and it builds out from there. Healthcare starts with the concern for the person. It starts with a connection to a human being, a recognition of a human being and their innate value as a human being to society, not based on what they've contributed to it, but based on the fact that they are a member of it. And EMS is part of a culture of hero worship.
Hmm.
And we put armed forces on a pedestal, first responders on a pedestal, and I want to make it abundantly clear that I am not disparaging that respect at all or saying that it is unwarranted. But with EMS, they are set up on a pedestal, sent through an educational program that tells them that they are going to be out there saving lives, running lights and sirens, doing all these fantastic things. And then what happens is you this is the that's the paradigm you think you're getting into, but the paradigm you're actually getting into is you are not an emergency medical provider, you are a pre-hospital medical provider. That is essentially what you are, and you are responding to people that have activated your services to facilitate their entry into the healthcare system. And what your role is to provide a health screening to triage how acute their symptoms are and determine whether or not you need to intervene or whether you just need to get them to the next level. There is a huge disparity between what you thought you were getting into, how that was built up, and how that's actually functioning. And it does not allow for the humility that's needed for its reality,
Mm-hmm.
because people are, whether they're aware of it or not, are offended by what they're actually doing as opposed to what they think they should be doing.
Right.
And that creates an oppositional relationship between providers and patients.
Mm-hmm.
And we have not even we haven't even opened the box that says how to humility for EMS.
Yeah, it's a hard one too. Um, I look back just on my personal experiences of in medicine where I realized like, hey, I don't know. There's it's multifactorial. Like there's clinical knowledge base. There's just human interactions. Like treat that person's a person. That patient's not a problem. That patient is a human being that has human feelings. That if you subject them to many of the just dehumanizing aspects that are nestled throughout healthcare, like it's gonna create just that yucky feeling for that patient. I think like um I guess that being said, how what are some of your techniques that you have used while precepting or teaching if you have a say a difficult student or maybe a jaded burned out medic? Like how do you recage them? Like, hey man, like no, this is a person.
I lost you there for a second, so I didn't actually
Yeah,
hear the
I just
question.
sorry, I am realizing that I'm dealing with rural Vermont internet. Apologies. Um, so, so essentially, the question was, how do we get, say, your students or your jaded, burned out medics, your guys who are long in the tooth, like, how do we recage them and help them recognize, like, no, that person that's lying on your cot is a human being with human feelings, and like you just can't treat them like the bone filled meat sack that you want them to feel like right now by your actions.
Uh, I mean, we have to realize that there's actually a commonality between the patients that he tends to have some resistance to and EMS personnel, which is that we both have lost the ability to help ourselves. If an addict could just suddenly not be an addict based on a decision that they just make in their head, they would have already made that decision and they would not be an addict. If you could just change your circumstances as a paramedic based on just saying we should just get paid more, or we shouldn't run as many calls, or we should be universal health care, or we should be able to force a refusal, or we should be able, if you could make any of those things happen by sheer force of will, you would have already made them happen. If any one person could have made those things happen by sheer force of will, they would have made them happen. A lot of the patients that EMS really gets fed up with have already lost control of their circumstances. They have already lost the ability to make good decisions, and they are reacting to their environment now. They're forced sometimes to be incredibly clever in order to survive. I was
Right.
thinking about this winter when we had it was like almost 0 degrees here. We almost never get that sort of
Yeah.
weather in
Oh, I know.
Georgia.
Yeah.
And I went outside and I was like, I could not imagine what I would do to get out of this weather if I was homeless.
Hmm.
I would lie, cheat, and steal because it's a matter of survival. And your body isn't functioning the way it's supposed to be because you're cold. You're not thinking as clearly because you're cold and because you're relying on, you know, you may have substance abuse problems. You're not getting proper nutrition. And so you're just being as clever as you possibly can to survive
Hmm.
for the next day. We just have to remember that they didn't create that environment. They're being molded by it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's one thing we see in pre-hospital medicine, emergency medicine. Like, it's hard not to get jaded. It's really hard not to get jaded, and I think that what you just said there is so spot on and poignant. That like, hey, if I'm going to do whatever I can to try to change my circumstances. It may not be like the major change that I need for true reform, but when someone's normal is so many like so many of the lousy situations we pick people up in, like just getting them out of that environment for 5 minutes might be the make or break difference. We never know. Um, that's I think that's one of the hardest things. I found myself, I'm guilty of it too. It's like you look down, you're like, but then quickly it's like you have to recage yourself. Who are we to judge somebody having the worst day of their life? Because if they picked up the phone and called us, or someone else, a lot of times someone else picked up the phone and called us, Like our job is there to provide the calm in the storm for that individual and hopefully help them along their way in their life journey to health and well-being, whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
I think that I do think that it is incredibly difficult right now to try to get the kindness and the humility and the compassion out of EMS that we're looking for. I mean, I try to promote kindness and positivity. I just got a tattoo that says "Saving lives begins with kindness,"
true.
and but I want to be very very cognizant of the fact that the circumstances that EMS are operating in across the board right now, it has put them in a position where they have nothing in reserve. Like to say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or I mean, I've said, hey, no one's coming to save us at this point. We have to save ourselves. We need to
Hmm.
start being kind and compassionate and caring and start ridding ourselves of the toxicity. But no one has anything in reserve. They have nothing to tap into. They are in the negative, and to try to ask them, hey, be more humble, be more kind, be more compassionate, be more caring. They just they have nothing to draw from. There's no water in the well.
Yeah, I think that's also an important thing that talking about grace, like giving people grace, giving yourself grace is an important thing too. Like, yeah, a lot of people get in the first response to do the epic saves, but hey, guess what? The epic saves are one out of 1,000 if you're lucky. And realizing that a simple act of kindness can go a significant long way. We're just talking basic humanity here. Just be nice. Treat someone as you want to be treated. The golden rule. I think that
Yeah.
that the thing you brought up about not having anything left in the tank is that's a huge one. And you're seeing like that's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down in the future. But like the moral injury, the mental health and well-being of the first responder is something that gets kind of taken for granted. The military, we've done a better job advocating for mental health, but like the first response space is starting to see like some pretty heavy traction in that direction. But like for the individual provider, the individual person listening to this, it's like, hey, you need to recognize your own limitations before something bad happens or you go code black on a call. You mentioned that when before you went into pediatrics, like you're 20 years in the 911 system. What were some of your red flags? And we're running short on time here, but like, what were some of your red flags that made you realize you had to make a change?
So I was someone that, generally speaking, my company always put people with who were like in paramedic school
Hmm.
or an EMT school, like a EMT school, somebody who was kind of like moving up the ladder and um, could benefit from me educating them and mentoring them and that sort of thing. They like to reserve the spot in my truck for that sort of people.
Hmm.
And after a while, I was enjoying the luxury of facilitating who would be my next partner if they moved on. And at one point, I somebody was put on my truck that I did not want on my truck, and not for a good reason.
Hmm.
I have already offered the apologies that this person deserves. But I did not treat him very well
Mm.
because I let's just say I did not treat him very well. And what I realized after the fact is that that is how my burnout was exhibiting itself,
Mm.
was that the only way that I could function was having a handpicked partner.
Hmm.
And it had been so long since I had to work with someone that I really didn't want to work with that I forgot that that's reality for most EMS personnel.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, you know what? I am taking, there is burnout here and I am focusing it on this partner.
Hmm.
And that was really what opened my eyes that it was time to do something new.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that story because you never know. Like someone may be on the same struggle bus. Like, why do I hate working with everybody? Like, hey guys, like take a minute. You might need to take a knee and face out and drink some water. Um, we've hit the hour time window. I'd like to kick it over to you for any parting thoughts, pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share with the next generation.
right now, the thing that I am really, really trying to emphasize is that we have to leave EMS better than when we found it. It is we say that it is up to someone else to fix EMS, and to a degree that is correct. That we can't change the conditions that we work in, but we can change our response to it. And think about how burnout you are and just how miserable that you may be. Remember that the person who has created that condition for you was where you were 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And you or someone like you is going to be there 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, and you're going to make it worse for the next generation if you don't do something to save yourself. And I firmly believe that saving lives begins with kindness, and that being kind to other people makes you feel better inside. And if you can just find somewhere in your body where there is a hidden reserve of just being kind to someone who needs it, I think you can start a process of actually affirming that kindness and positivity within yourself.
That's beautiful, and I'm not even gonna throw anything else out there because I can't top that, good sir. I appreciate that. Like it's super powerful words to live by, not just in the EMS space, like across the entire spectrum of humanity. Because at the end of the day, when we are given the charge of taking care of others, just the simplest things can go a long way. Jimmy, before we sign off, just hang around after we log off. I'd love to chat with you a little bit more. But again,
Yeah,
guys, thanks for joining this episode. Jimmy Apple, going to throw out all his social media handles that we can possibly drum up on the end here. And then again, Splints and Whiskey is brought to you by Life Autonomous Care Consultants, LACCINC.com. Check them out. Jimmy Apple, thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure. We'll
absolutely.
chat soon.
Thanks.